Oh, before we get started, my comic Dr. Alpha Miracle Child is now live on Indiegogo. If you've ever wondered what Fight Club's Tyler Durden would be like as a mad scientist, or ever been interested in fast-paced, over-the-top supervillain action with complex story and characters inspired from the themes of Alan Moore's Killing Joke and the ruthless pulp style of Frank Miller's Sin City, then I suggest you give it a look. Also, everyone who backs will be eligible for an exclusive bonus story, Lady Midnight, The Jolly Goodbye, which, should we get funded, the digital version will be sent out to backers by Christmas, and this story will be included in the first printing only, which means that any other iteration of Dr. Alpha or a second printing will not contain this story. And backers now have the opportunity to see their supervillains as central characters, either as a main antagonist or an ally to Lady Midnight. Links to the campaign can be found in the description or by clicking the icon in the upper right-hand corner. Now, on to the video. I'd like to open this video with a quote from the great Han Solo. "That's not how the Force works." What is a Mary Sue? This question has haunted writers for decades, sometimes for better and sometimes for worse. But it seems that the common definition has become more or less a character who is too powerful or too perfect. However, that isn't always necessarily the case. After all, you have characters like Dream from Neil Gaiman's Sandman, whose powers are considered to be more powerful than the gods of any pantheon. You have Superman, who is super strong, intelligent, handsome, and possesses nigh incorruptible morals. He's beloved by the people he protects. He's selfless, kind, and generous. He personifies what every hero should strive to become. And to top it off, he has more power than an entire superhero team combined. But these qualities alone don't definitively prove that a character is a Mary Sue. While writer quality may vary over the decades of Superman's existence, both the characters of Dream and Superman overall are beloved characters and aren't typically considered Mary Sues. Why? Because the dirty truth behind a Mary Sue is that it is ultimately a product of bad writing. But what does that mean? In a previous video, I explored a more universal definition of what constitutes a character as a Mary Sue, and at the risk of lingering on old ground for too long, I'll say that the summary of my definition is a character to which the plot and universe bend. From laws to people to plain logic and common sense, all of these things can and will be bent or broken in the presence of a Mary Sue.
Hold on, but that describes every protagonist ever.
Some ill-bred ignoramus might call as a cloud of Dorito dust puffs whimsically into the air, but that would be incorrect.
Me? Incorrect?
Because while a character might not be immediately classified as a Mary Sue if they defeat a veteran soldier in single combat, the character might earn that label if the character in question doesn't have the training, skill, or combat experience to face down said veteran, let alone defeat him. These are what we'll call Mary Sue moments. For example, if a fresh-faced farm boy who's never even seen a sword suddenly picks one up and, without any kind of outside divine or supernatural aid, defeats a war veteran of 15 years in single combat, you likely just witnessed a Mary Sue moment. If a genius terrorist who has been shown to be brilliant enough to outsmart the good guys at every turn with meticulous skill, leaving no opening unguarded, and then the newbie field agent enters the scene and suddenly the genius terrorist begins to make silly, uncharacteristic mistakes, or his once hyper-competent underlings suddenly become incompetent for no explained reason, then you'd likely just witnessed a Mary Sue moment. If your everyman rookie pilot flies off to face down a squadron of elite enemy pilots infamous for their skill and wins easily for no adequately explained reason other than he's just awesome, you likely just witnessed a Mary Sue moment. In fact, if the only explanation you can find for a character's power is they're just awesome, then you're likely looking at a Mary Sue. So the reason why characters as powerful as Dream or as supposedly perfect as Superman are well liked and aren't usually considered Mary Sues is because the plot doesn't treat them as such. By themselves, there's no way of knowing. A Mary Sue isn't just a character, because a character can be equipped with all manner of skills and powers. It all depends on how they are treated by the plot. And it's through a pattern of these Mary Sue moments, or lack thereof, that we will see why Luke Skywalker stands as a good character, and why Rey stands as a lifeless, blatant Mary Sue. Thanks to Disney's ever-increasing laziness pushed onto us under the thin veneer of homage, the stories of Rey and Luke Skywalker make a fairly easy side-by-side comparison, since the respective tales of A New Hope and The Force Awakens share many similarities. The presence of a soul in A New Hope being one of the only major glaring differences when lined up against The Force Awakens' rancid, shambling husk. And keep in mind that the heart of the original Star Wars trilogy was the hero's journey formula, which at its heart follows the story of a relatively normal person going through a series of trials to emerge a powerful hero by the end. And it seems that Disney's Star Wars trilogy was attempting to follow in the original trilogy's footsteps, which means Rey and Luke are both expected to begin their journey as relatively normal people, discounting legendary fathers, ancient prophecies, etc. And considering both protagonists eventually develop and change as the journey progresses, it can be argued that this is a pretty decent assumption to make. So let's begin with character setup. Luke enters the story as a farm boy, a moisture farmer to be exact. Rey enters her story as a lone scavenger, a circumstance people have pointed out as an early deal breaker, an early Mary Sue moment. And those people have a point. But things aren't that simple. Rey surviving alone on a hostile planet wouldn't necessarily classify as a Mary Sue moment, and it wouldn't necessarily break the narrative either, even in a hero's journey formula. However, here's where the plot takes a wrong turn. Luke Skywalker is introduced with a particular set of skills such as general knowledge on droids, how to drive, and how to use weaponry. Now, how does he know these things? Believe it or not, the movie doesn't need to tell us directly. It is a movie after all. It can show us things, and we as the audience can make logical connections. So we can logically assume that Luke was taught these skills by his uncle Owen. And why would he do that? Because Luke is presented to us as an essential worker on Owen's farm. In fact, it becomes a point of conflict for Luke's character when he expresses his desire to leave and join an academy, and then Owen forces him to stay. To quote Owen, "Harvest is when I need you the most. It's only one season more. This year we'll make enough on the harvest that I'll be able to hire some more hands, and then you can go to the academy next year. You must understand, I need you here, Luke." From what the audience is given, we can reasonably conclude that the skills Luke has come from growing up on a farm residing on a hostile planet. Rey doesn't have anything for the audience to connect with. Instead, the movie decides to focus on how alone she is, which we could have already gathered when she was introduced, as a lone scavenger, collecting things to bring back to an old abandoned AT-AT. In fact, you could say that she's almost like a human version of Pixar's WALL-E, without the humanity. This might be a general problem with the film, but the focus on how alone and lonely she is seemed to cause quite a few missed opportunities that could have given us more detail about Rey's character, that is, if she had one. WALL-E liked to collect things. When the movie takes us back to his particularly humble abode, we see that it's filled with various odds and ends, pieces of junk that WALL-E had found interesting. We see him interact with these items. Without being told directly, we can see his fascination with humanity, and we get a strong sense of his character through these interactions. Through his meticulous organization of his items, we can see how much he cares. When he puts that lid on his head, we get a clearer sense of his desired connection to humanity by mimicking human behavior. In contrast, Rey's house gives us two sentimental items, a wilting flower and a doll. She doesn't interact with either, so we don't get any additional information other than she's lonely, which has already been established. These items could have served the plot better if they were symbols of Rey's parents. This is especially important because now it's more difficult to use the "she was mentored by her parents" explanation. Luke was taught farming skills by his uncle because his uncle was a farmer. The movie spends a decent amount of time establishing this fact, while Rey can scavenge and survive alone on the desert home planet because she's just awesome. While her parents do exist as a possible explanation, thanks to Captain Mystery Box, we don't even get a visual clue, where we could have seen, for example, a journal of notes with a name on it that Rey uses as a reference when looking for valuable parts to scavenge, hinting to a scavenger parent, or at least a scavenger mentor, and would therefore give the audience a satisfying conclusion as to how Rey got these skills. We got nothing. And this leaves her defenders to argue that Rey has survived all alone because, you guessed it, she's just awesome. Though it's probably been repackaged as some combination of Rey being strong, independent, brave, etc. But even if you can accept that explanation and are willing to wave off her unexplained skills, that's fine, because this Mary Sue moment alone doesn't mark Rey as a Mary Sue, and it gets worse. Let's go back to Luke Skywalker. From the moment we meet him, we can see he's kind of whiny. He'd rather be off with his friends instead of doing farm work. What teenager wouldn't? To quote, "Luke, but I was going to Tosh Station to pick up some power converters. Owen, you can waste time with your friends when your chores are done." We later find out his whiny behavior isn't just typical teenage angst, but a case of Disney princess syndrome. In other words, Luke Skywalker yearns for something more. He thirsts for adventure. Owen, look, it's only one season more. Luke, yeah, that's what you said when Biggs and Tank left. Baru, where are you going? Luke, looks like I'm going nowhere. Then we have Baru. Luke's not a farmer, Owen. He has too much of his father in him. Now, once you get past the sheer awesomeness that Luke had a friend named Tank, we see evidence of Luke's frustration. We get the feeling that he's itching to go off on some wild-eyed quest, but can't. Then he sees Princess Leia and becomes immediately motivated by her. Luke, who is she? She's beautiful. To clarify, we get a good look at Luke's motivations, his desire to leave that lonely backwater world behind. The only thing we got from Rey was her desire to stay on her backwater planet and wait for her parents to return. And at this point, one might say she's motivated to help the Resistance. But we can see that while she has heard of the Resistance, just like Luke had heard of the Rebellion, we're never given a reason to think she really cares. Because, unlike Luke, Rey isn't determined to leave. Luke wanted to follow his friends, transmit his application to the Academy. In fact, during the course of her journey, Rey insists that she must return home. So, when the time comes for her to go charging off into the galaxy, it seems forced. Now, that isn't to say she needs to be a wild-eyed adventurer. On the contrary, even in a hero's journey formula, you can have a main character who doesn't want to leave their home. Rey instead is presented to us as more of a Bilbo Baggins type, content to stay where she is until something or someone pulls her into an adventure. This is what seems to happen, but actually, she ends up choosing to go on the adventure. Why? Because of one defining character trait that wasn't hinted at, and instead manifests itself just when the plot demanded it. A trait I'll get into in a moment. Now let's look back at Rey's more human counterpart, WALL-E. The creators of WALL-E used his interaction with certain items to show us his personality, but then they used a mix of his interest in human objects and his now established personality to give us his motivation: romance. WALL-E becomes entranced by a romantic musical film, and we, as the audience members, can see how deeply the idea of romance affects him. Then we see this hint play out when we see him become instantly enraptured by Eva. So enraptured that he took off on an adventure just to follow her. It gives us a plausible, organic flow from one point to the next. WALL-E, much like Rey, is portrayed as being lonely, and the creators use his romantic loneliness as a motive for him to leave on an adventure. But unlike WALL-E, Rey was given no such setup. Every instance of her being portrayed as lonely is done to do just that. Tell us she's alone. Remember that one defining character trait I mentioned Rey had? The driving character element that ousts her from her lonely daily life? If you recall, what sparks her adventure is her encounter with BB-8, when she saves the droid from another scavenger. For some reason, some might think that this is evidence of Rey's kind heart. Right after helping BB-8, she does nothing. She just leaves the droid where she found it, which again feels off. Rey not only saves the droid, but speaks to it like a human. You'd think that mentality would stay consistent, but she just leaves. I mean, Leon from The Professional was a lone assassin and still decided to save Matilda's life, make her laugh, and letting her sleep over, before almost killing her / kicking her out. Frank Martin from The Transporter was considerate enough to give a kidnapped girl something to drink before turning her over to her kidnappers. Even Han Solo, the iconic bad boy, left the barkeep some money after he shot Greedo. Rey could have offered BB-8 some assistance so it wouldn't be taken by the scavengers again, but she walks away, with the scavenger she just saved it from still in view. You'd think someone kind-hearted would be a little kinder. So why did she get involved at all? Who knows? Maybe she read the script, or maybe she's just awesome. This too would have been a simple matter to set up. Even WALL-E hinted at the main character's kind-hearted nature when we saw him give affection to his pet cockroach. Again, Rey's introduction had focused so much on showing her being a strong, independent woman, they forgot to add meaning. They almost had it too. Remember this flower? Had it look cared for? And had we seen Rey care for it like Leon cared for his plant? A symbol of life and care amidst a harsh desert planet. That would have been hint enough, but we didn't get that. Instead, we got nothing, which again sets us up for another moment of she's just awesome, a Mary Sue moment. Also, you would think a kind-hearted person would have verbally confronted Finn when BB-8 told Rey he was wearing Poe Dameron's jacket, instead of instantly beating him up like BB-8's personal attack dog. By all accounts, what broke her steadfast dedication to staying and waiting for her parents to return was not a thirst for adventure, or even an event that forced her hand like Gandalf did with Bilbo. What motivates Rey to begin her quest, her main identifiable trait, is liking BB-8. Until now, her only established desire was to wait for her parents. For some reason, maybe they're supposed to bring back a really good birthday cake. Maybe she loves them. Maybe she hates them. It's not clear because, again, we're given nothing. No story about her father being a great warrior, or fond recollections of her mother telling her stories about the Jedi, nothing. And remember, she was going to abandon BB-8 until the droid begged to go with her. So it's a little jarring when the next minute she's beating up men twice her size and tackling Finn like he ate the last french fry. When this character switch happens, there's usually an event that endears defendee to defender, like when Matilda proved her strength by shooting a gun out the window, after which Leon decided to train her, or when Luke proved himself to Han over the course of an adventure, after which Han flew in to save Luke during the Death Star run. We don't get any such thing with Rey or BB-8. There's no scene where BB-8 proves its usefulness to Rey. The only reason Luke chased down R2-D2 is because he didn't want his uncle to know that his hormones drove him to remove R2's restraining bolt, so he could see more Princess Leia, which then allowed R2-D2 to run away in the first place. Rey just decides to adopt BB-8 like a new dog from one scene to the next, for no reason other than she's suddenly, i.e. without being previously established, just that noble, or just that awesome. Again, it could have been an easy setup. Remember when Rey was polishing those scraps and she spotted the old lady doing the same exact thing? She could have offered to help, sacrificing her own time for no expected reward, but she didn't. Instead, they used that scene to further indulge into telling us how hard Rey's life is. And the same can go for her sudden ability to fight off two thugs.
But she's a woman living on her own. Of course she would know how to fight.
Belches some gargantuan grotesque. Again, there was no setup. And again, this could have and should have been done during the introduction. Maybe instead of the several scenes of her eating and making food, as if this were a college life documentary, we could have gotten a shot of her practicing. Just a small segment of her going through the motions. But instead, we have nothing. So when we see her suddenly able to beat up some thugs with almost no problem, these skills just seem to manifest. And the only explanation we're left with is that she's just awesome. Narratively speaking, if the goal is to run Rey through a hero's journey, it would be better if she could defend herself but not be able to actually defeat them. It would show weakness, vulnerability. In other words, it would show her potential, but also leave room to grow. If you remember, even Luke needed help. And let's talk about that. In A New Hope, Luke is noted as an excellent pilot on several occasions. Rey only mentions her piloting skills in passing, but it is mentioned, so it's not really a hindrance. But their respective piloting skills alone aren't the main point here. Luke's piloting skills are a much larger point than one might initially think. But first, let's go to one of the biggest grievances often referred to by the Star Wars faithful: Rey fixing the Millennium Falcon better than Han Solo, its former owner. The usual defense for this is that Rey is a scavenger and lives alone, and can therefore fix things like a trained mechanic. But we don't know this for sure, because again, this skill was never hinted at. After all, there's a big difference between breaking things and fixing them. For example, even someone without technical skill likely knows what is and isn't valuable on a car, and so any scavenger might know the value of particular ship parts. But knowing what parts do and what pieces are worth doesn't mean she knows how to fix the ship she takes them from, unless you think someone picking through a dump for something they can trade for cigarette money is also therefore a top-notch mechanic. And once more, the movie had the perfect opportunity for a setup and missed it entirely. All they had to do was introduce Rey as a scavenger in the morning and an employee at a local mechanic shop in the evening, kind of like how Rocky Balboa was a boxer and part-time mob enforcer. Instead, it became another instance of she's just awesome. Then we go back to the scene where Finn rushes in to help Rey fight off her attackers only to arrive too late because she had already defeated them. Even if you dismissed every example until now, well, remember when I mentioned that logic tended to bend around a Mary Sue? To quote General Hux, "My men are exceptionally trained, programmed from birth." This includes Finn. While it's noted that Finn was different and had been given custodial duty, like the guys from Full Metal Jacket were given custodial duty, it doesn't change the fact that Finn had been trained to be a soldier from birth. Even if Finn had been the worst stormtrooper in the bunch, undergoing decades of training should still have an effect. So even if Finn was so pathetic that he would lose in a straight fight against another stormtrooper, it could be logically concluded that when going against someone presumably self-taught like Rey, Finn should still be able to overpower her. But he was overpowered immediately. I guess he had one hell of a doctor's note. Now let's go to Han Solo. The first time she meets Han, he's getting confronted by two gangs. She eventually saves them all, only for Han to pilot the Millennium Falcon, which Rey has already been shown to be quite capable of doing herself. The only piece of help Han actually does offer is his connection to Maz, which they can use to smuggle BB-8 to the Resistance. So why did I mention all that? Allow me to summarize. Rey saves BB-8, saves herself and Finn from the First Order, saves Finn during Han Solo's fiasco, and saves Han Solo from his own idiocy. The idiocy being a man who has spent decades as an outlaw, having suddenly gotten himself tangled up with two gangs. It's almost like a bad sitcom. Rey shows up and suddenly Han Solo is an idiot. Not to mention Rey saving Finn during the Kylo Ren encounter. Rey is already awesome. She's the one doing all the saving. Where's the room for growth? In contrast, Luke needed plenty of help during his first movie. In fact, had it not been for his companions, he wouldn't have survived. In fact, had it not been for Obi-Wan Kenobi, Luke probably would have died after the Sand People attacked. Afterward, it was Han Solo who took charge when trying to escape the Empire. The only play Luke made during the whole movie was that he heard that the beautiful Princess Leia was being held aboard the Death Star. Then his hormones valiantly kicked in, and those drove him to convince Han to go along with saving Leia by making him imagine a reward, then coming up with a half-baked plan to rescue her. The plan of course backfires, and it ends in a shootout, which probably would have gotten everyone killed if the Empire had not allowed them to escape in the first place. And keep in mind that they only managed to muddle through that thanks to Obi-Wan's sacrifice and the fighting skills of Han and Chewbacca. Now let's go back to Rey during the Han Solo fiasco. When Han is being confronted by the two gangs, Rey's plan is to trap the gangs inside different rooms while they escape. She makes a mistake, which then accidentally releases a group of very dangerous creatures, which then come out to devour both gangs, allowing Rey and the rest to make an escape without being pursued. Her mistake ended in a better scenario than her original plan. The only person on her side to get caught was of course Finn, who I think is personally hated by the writer. But Rey of course saves him because she knows exactly how to operate devices and controls on a ship she's never been on before, because she's just awesome. But what does this all have to do with Luke's piloting skills? Rey is introduced with unexplained expert fighting skills, technical skills, and magical expert level piloting skills despite only dabbling. Still no sign of a mentor, and she uses all these skills to save the day. Meanwhile, Luke's only defining skill during the first movie is his piloting skill, and it's referred to several times. When Luke wants to leave the farm for the academy, when Obi-Wan mentions that he's heard Luke has become a great pilot, when he mentions that Luke's father Anakin was one of the best pilots in the galaxy, when they meet Han and Luke says he wasn't such a bad pilot, hinting he could buy and fly the ship rather than pay Han. Then the mention that he'd like to spend his days flying his T-16, and Bull's eyeing womp rats, letting us know what kind of practice he's had. Luke spent the whole first movie mostly being a burden. By this time, the movie's events had hardened Luke, changed him. He's now more experienced, no longer the farm boy from Tatooine. This results in Luke finally having his big hero moment when he became the one to destroy the Death Star. But even then, it wasn't just Luke's piloting skills that allowed him to save the day. It was the Force. Luke trusted his instincts and used the Force to help guide his hand, letting him know when to fire. And he was only able to do so after having the assistance from a mentor. Keep this moment in mind. I'll be coming back to it soon. The first time Rey encounters the Force is when Luke Skywalker's lightsaber happens to be in Maz's bar, for some reason. So a legendary sword just so happens to be in a bar where they're just going to get help smuggling BB-8 to the Resistance. There was no logical reason for the audience to even suppose that such an item would be there. And not only a legendary weapon sitting in some back room of a cantina, but it also calls out to Rey, making up new Force rules in the process. But even if inanimate objects could use the Force, why wouldn't it call out to Han, who had a much stronger connection to Luke? I guess it pays to be the DM's girlfriend. Rey then gets captured later on. Kylo Ren tries to read her mind, and she not only rejects him, but then reads his mind. And remember, Kylo had been trained by Luke Skywalker and then trained by Snoke, yet Rey, who had no established mentor of any kind, overpowered overpowers him. So any argument pertaining to the Force being supercharged more or less falls apart there, since if that were true, Kylo should be supercharged with the benefit of training, and so Rey should have still been no match for Kylo. So instead, the only explanation for her overpowering Kylo in this instance is, you guessed it, she's just awesome. Then if that weren't enough, she controls the mind of his stormtrooper to let her go and leave his weapon behind. But she grew up with stories about the Jedi, so of course it's reasonable, some man-bunned man-baby might whimper. Firstly, this would be like hearing stories about Bruce Lee and suddenly being able to perform the 1-inch punch. And I don't know about you, but outmatching someone's trained thought probe before controlling someone's mind sounds pretty advanced. A far cry from using the Force to guide your instincts a bit. Imagine a dojo that teaches the 5-point palm exploding heart technique on day 1. And second of all, Luke had also heard stories about the Jedi. He just didn't know his father was one. One might say she siphoned the knowledge from Kylo Ren when she read his mind. If this were true, then there would be no need for Jedi temples and no real need for decades of training. A master could just copy and paste his knowledge and drag it over to his Padawan. And remember, the expanded universe at this point is considered non-canon, and such a feat never took place in any of the movies. So if Rey's newly acquired Force powers were gained through either of these scenarios, it would again be another rule being created solely for the sake of Rey, the plot bending to her needs. But movie-wise, she, of course, learns these things because she's just awesome. Now back with Luke. Remember the moment he used the Force to help launch those torpedoes? This was Luke's only real practical use of the Force during the entire first movie. Luke had the assistance of a mentor and the benefit of training so he could blow up the Death Star, which, by the way, required skills that the movie stated Luke already had plenty of practice with, piloting and shooting. So in the end, the Force was only supplemental to his victory and not the entire cause. Rey, however, was already reading minds and dominating brains, both without proper instruction and still no assistance from a mentor. How is this possible? Well, because she's just awesome. And this sudden mastery stays in play during the entire climactic battle with Kylo Ren. Finn, of course, has the honor of battling Kylo Ren first, and it's really the first time in the entire movie we see him be useful, and we get to see the arguments I've been making put into action. Because, fortunately for Finn, Rey needs him to protect her while she's unconscious, and so the reality warping powers of the Mary Sue kind of lift. Finn is finally allowed to access those decades of training Hux mentioned he was supposed to have, and not only hold his own against Kylo, but actually wounds him. Unfortunately for Finn and the rest of the audience, Rey eventually regains consciousness. Her reality warping powers reactivate, Finn's combat skills return to dormancy, and he's quickly overcome. Now let's take a look at Rey, a scavenger. Without the benefit of Finn's decades of military level training, has no sign of a mentor, and is completely self-taught. How does she fare against Kylo Ren, who, if you recall, has been trained by not one, but 2 legendary mentors? Well, she defeats him, of course. Did you forget that she's just awesome? Does anyone remember Luke's duel against Darth Vader in A New Hope? No, you probably don't, because it didn't happen. Darth Vader was Luke's rival. Until the Emperor made an appearance, he represented the power of the Empire. Kylo seemed to be playing this role for Rey. Darth Vader was responsible for Leia's capture, and he forced her hand into sending the Death Star plans to a desert planet. Darth Vader also killed Luke's mentor and nearly wiped out the entire Rebel assault squad. From the very first time we see him, Darth Vader is shown to be a powerful obstacle to overcome, and so acts as a final test of Luke's heroic progression. That only once he has matured into his final heroic form was he able to finally defeat the looming specter that is Darth Vader. Considering Han is the closest thing Rey gets to a mentor, even though he teaches her nothing and is actually taught a few things by Rey because, well, she's just awesome, it can be easy to see a parallel between the role of Darth Vader towards Luke and the role of Kylo Ren towards Rey. At least, it should have been that way. Now, it isn't wrong for the hero and villain to have a battle towards the end of the first encounter, even in a trilogy. And again, the movie was very close to pulling this off correctly. All they had to do was have Rey lose the battle. But Kylo was injured, and that's why Rey won, an ill-bred ignoramus might blubber. But even if you put aside that Kylo was also injured during his fight with a soldier possessing decades of training and still won, narratively speaking, Kylo still should have dominated in his bout with Rey. As I mentioned before, Darth Vader's powers set the goal for Luke and the audience. We get to see the end goal in the shape of Vader's ominous figure, and this notion is amplified when Luke actually does face Vader in The Empire Strikes Back, and after spending a number of days training with the legendary Yoda, Vader still easily dominated. It showed us that despite Luke's growth, he still had a long way to go. With Rey and Kylo, the setup begins perfectly. He's wounded from getting shot by Chewbacca's bowcaster and his fight with Finn. Considering Rey's vast inexperience relative to his own, he still should have defeated her, if not through battle, then by the Force alone. I mean, a Deus Ex Machina has to swoop in and separate them anyway. Why not have her lose? Remember, this is the first movie in Rey's trilogy, her first tender steps into her own hero's journey. Her loss would have raised the stakes. Show us that Rey, like Luke when he first began, still has quite the journey yet to travel before she reaches her full potential. Because if she was still so easily defeated by Kylo while he was in such a diminished state, how could she possibly hope to win when next they met? It would prompt a personal and relatable drive for her to seek Luke Skywalker, other than it's what the script told her to do. A true motivation to start training other than, well, it's just something you do in Star Wars. And the movie actually supports this idea. It's almost as if they had the competent writer do the script and Rian Johnson snuck in his fan fiction when the real writer went off on coffee break. And you can literally see the moment when this happens because Kylo does dominate to begin with. Then the good writer goes off for coffee, Rey becomes a Mary Sue again, and defeats Kylo pretty easily. They try to play this off by having Rey close her eyes while locking sabers with Kylo, as if she's summoning her strength. Usually this means a moment of awakening or harmony for the hero, where they fully absorb the wisdom and teachings they've attained so far, and then use those teachings to challenge the villain. Kind of like when Luke heard Obi-Wan's voice telling him to use the Force, or when Neo returned to life in the first Matrix movie. The awakening is normally sparked by something or someone, and that spark helps the hero align their skills and wisdom together, and this allows a hero to turn a near defeat into a victory. But Rey didn't have a mentor or a love interest, no one who knew her intimately enough to spark her awakening. Rey isn't remembering the words of a loved one or the wisdom of a teacher. She just closes her eyes and is suddenly now able to defeat Kylo Ren, because she's just awesome. A real shame too. Had Rey lost, then when next they met, the meeting would be tense, since the audience wouldn't be certain what a fully healed Kylo Ren and a newly trained Rey would truly be capable of. Instead, Rey didn't receive training because Luke turned into an edgy 13-year-old, and because Rey didn't actually need it, because she's already so awesome. Where Luke needed days of intense mental guidance and rigorous physical training just to lift a few rocks, Rey was breaking the earth 5 minutes into her first lesson because she's so awesome. Though they try to hide it by saying she's strong in the Force, you know, like Luke, who, as I said, needed intense training before he could lift a few rocks, or like Kylo Ren, who had the advantage of training under skilled teachers, and who still lost to Rey, because Kylo might be so powerful he turned Luke into an emo, but he's no Mary Sue. Meanwhile, after days and days of rigorous sitting around, Rey is suddenly able to move half a mountain, because she's so awesome. I guess this really is a millennial power fantasy. So to summarize, Rey isn't a Mary Sue because of any single incident or oddity, but a consistent pattern. Luke had a mentor to teach him, he had a rival to challenge him, he had a past as a farm boy to introduce him, he had training to mold him, and unlike Rey, who of course don't need no man, Luke had friends to help him. Nearly every skill and talent Rey learns or possesses throughout her journey is granted by the plot, as it bows to her every command. No hint of a mentor to teach her, no rival to challenge her, no past to introduce her, no training to mold her, and she accomplished everything she needed to accomplish almost entirely on her own. Or in short, every skill Rey possesses is there because she's just awesome. You sound like an angry man, baby, who just hates women, some feral feminist might hideously gurgle. While it's true the term Mary Sue might be misused to justify one's dislike of a character or design choice, like those angry man babies who get upset because someone is the wrong gender, has the wrong skin color, or the wrong sexuality. But there are times when the term is justified, especially if you've defined the term and have evidence to back up your definition. But there's one major thing that separates mere complaint from constructive critique, and that is advice on how to improve. Could Rey have been a good character? Could she have been fixed if those in charge of Star Wars weren't drunk at the wheel? Yes, and just like in every other instance often vigorously defended by the pouty mafia and the Reylo fan club of Innsmouth with their endless whatabouts and obfuscations, this problem too is easily remedied. How? Just like Luke Skywalker's character was established as a farm boy and later revealed to be the son of a skilled pilot, both of which help the audience logically accept his far above average piloting skill as a mix of experience and talent. Rey's introductory circumstance not only could have done the same, but also fixed nearly every problem I've stated so far. So what is it? What's the easy fix? You can keep Rey a lone scavenger, you can keep her technical skill intact, and you can even keep her protagonist level fighting skill. But instead of having Rey waiting around for her parents we know nothing about, have her instead be waiting for the return of her Jedi Master. Imagine if that instead of nothing, Rey's backstory could have involved her being sold into slavery as a child. Then a powerful Jedi who had been hiding since the Clone Wars days appeared like the lone gunman in a western to clean up the town. The Jedi then adopts Rey. They live a quiet life on a lonely desert world. The Jedi teaches Rey how to survive on her own, where to find water, how to repair a vehicle, how to find food, how to scavenge and hunt. And more importantly, Rey would have not only heard stories about the Jedi, but had already started her training in the Force. Maybe Rey would ask, where did you learn how to do all these things? And the Jedi would answer, my master taught me. Then a few years later, when Rey was older, maybe 12 or 13, the Jedi had to leave on an urgent quest. Maybe the Jedi's old master was still alive, but had turned to the dark side. Maybe Rey begged the Jedi to stay because the Jedi was the only one in her life to ever treat her with any kindness or care. Maybe the Jedi promised to return soon, but never did. And maybe Rey's love, loyalty, and trust were such that she became dedicated to stay on Jakku until she saw the Jedi again. Changing Rey from someone with missing parents to the adopted Padawan of a jaded veteran Jedi would give us all the explanation we needed from an audience point of view. It could have been easily explained or presumed that Rey's war veteran Jedi mentor taught her how to survive, how to fight, and helped her take the first steps into the use of the Force. This, of course, would change the hero's journey formula, but only a bit. Rey would start off with some trained skills, so she wouldn't be the everyman Luke Skywalker was, but there would still be room for growth. How do I know? Because the same variation was done in Avatar: The Last Airbender. Aang, being the reincarnation of the Avatar, was born a prodigy-level bender. He had more or less mastered airbending, and could learn the other elements relatively quick. But over 3 seasons, Aang changed and grew the same way Luke Skywalker did. Just like Luke changed from a hormone-driven farm boy thirsty for adventure to a mature and focused Jedi, Aang changed from the kid who just wanted to play games and run away from his problems to a hero who'd face down the great Fire Lord. And the same could have been done with Rey. We could have gotten a story of love, loss, and devotion. A story that made us question who the truly important people are in our lives. That nothing will happen by sitting around and waiting. That we must take chances and seize the day. And maybe that not everyone can be a hero, but that anyone can be. Even a little forgotten orphan girl tossed away by her parents. And that maybe in this world where a sadly sardonic gaggle of malicious malcontents laugh at your outrage over space wizards in one breath and then act like the next Martin Luther King when they cry over the anatomy of cartoon women in the next, that it isn't actually the presence of sexism or racism or fascism that has caused said outrage, but an absence of meaning.